Thank you very much, John. And thank you. It's a huge honor to be standing here discussing our research. I wanted to start with some context. Normally, when we think of marketing science, marketing practice, and a practitioner, this is the image that comes to mind. Someone who works in a large corporation, often publicly listed, making big decisions about big things. What we're going to talk about here is a different type of entrepreneur, a different type of marketing practitioner. Someone who looks like this, often in poverty and living in a developing country. Now, their world may look very different from our own, but the proverbial fortune at the bottom of the pyramid will only be a mirage to large corporations, among others, if their worlds are not better understood. They are the customers who might drive global growth. They are suppliers. A company as large as Hershey or Nestle relies on hundreds of thousands of small farmers, cocoa farmers, for example, in places like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Procter & Gamble has 25 million small businesses as distributors in emerging markets. And their efficiency, their ability to scale in emerging markets is very much a function of these millions of small business owners. Now, the challenge that both practitioners as well as policymakers in developing countries have pointed to is that most businesses in emerging markets are small. So as an example, the typical American manufacturing firm has 40 employees. The typical Indian manufacturing firm has 2.6 employees. The typical firm in America, manufacturing firm that has been around for 40 years, is 7 times larger than the typical firm that's been around for less than 5 years. So massive growth in the United States, 7 times higher. In India, the typical firm that's been around for 40 years is the same size as a typical firm that's been around for 5 years or less. So not only are they small, the growth is stunted, and they'll eke out lives of poverty. Now, this phenomenon, which has been called the missing middle phenomenon, is not unknown to practitioners, it's not unknown to policymakers, but the typical response has been one at the policy level that involves institutions. For example, better property rights, or better information about how to register your business and make it more formal, or simple human capital issues, important around health, education, and such, or access to finance. More recently, some studies have looked at a phenomenon called managerial capital. And here the focus has largely been on financial skills, the idea being that firms might be able to scale up or grow and increase prosperity in developing countries if they have better financial skills. The role of marketing skills has, to the best of our knowledge, been ignored. Now, to the extent they have been studied, it's been in the form of case studies rather than in the form of formal marketing science. Now, this state of affairs implies that there are serious doubts in the minds of policymakers, senior policymakers, about the role of marketing, or indeed, often it's ignored. Researchers have shown mixed effects. We'll talk about this later on. No less a luminary than Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize winning pioneer of microfinance, points out, the poor do not need us to teach them how to survive. They already know. So rather than waste our time teaching them new skills, we try to make maximum use of their existing skills. The question we try to answer in this implementation of marketing science is, what is the impact of marketing skills on prosperity and growth? We believe this is a fairly fundamental question, not only for our field as marketing, but also for practice and policy. Now, what we'd like to do next is to describe the implementation approach. And to do so, let me introduce you to the CEO by video, to the CEO of our partner organization that helped implement a marketing skills training program. And this is Tom Perry, CEO of Business Bridge, our partner organization.
Welcome back. Now, in an environment where education is greatly needed, Business Bridge is a global initiative delivering quality, low-cost business education to those for whom access is otherwise denied by virtue of cost or lack of local provision. Joining us in our Cape Town studio for more on their operations in South Africa is Tom Perry, the CEO of Business Bridge. Tom, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Talk us through what differentiates Business Bridge from other initiatives targeting entrepreneurs.
So what we're really trying to do is take high quality business education and make it affordable and accessible to micro entrepreneurs. And by that we mean delivering education in the communities themselves rather than making the entrepreneurs leave their communities to come to enterprise development centers or to business schools. So we set up our courses in existing enterprise development centers or in the communities themselves so that we're really getting communities to work together. So business owners with similar aspirations, from similar backgrounds, dealing with similar markets, coming together to learn from each other.
Of course, Tom, we're aware that you've got quite interesting partners here. We've got the London Business School, you've got the World Bank. Talk us through how these partnerships have come about.
Okay, so Business Bridge started in 2009. It was the brainchild of a professor at London Business School. We were then launched down here in South Africa as a Section 21 in 2010. And we started running our courses, so taking experienced business people, so business school alumni, successful entrepreneurs, people with corporate business backgrounds, training them to deliver our courses and getting them into townships and communities to help train up entrepreneurs. Now, one of the researchers at London Business School, a guy doing his PhD thesis, saw the model that we were operating. He was very interested in development economics and wanted to test this new model of entrepreneurship development. He wanted to see if you can train up an entrepreneur in order to get them to create jobs and to increase their revenues. So what he did was work with us over about 2 years to help us refine our model, to help us really include as many innovations as we possibly could, to make sure we learned from previous World Bank studies, previous research projects that had happened in the past. And he then got these major partners on board in terms of, well, he represents London Business School. He received funding from the World Bank and helped us to scale on that global scale.
Tom Perry mentioned a PhD student who was working on it. Let me introduce you to the former PhD student in question, Stephen.
Thanks, Rajesh. Yeah, so as Tom mentioned, this is a very exciting program, an application of marketing science with which we can implement. However, testing the effects are not necessarily so easy, given some very common problems in marketing science. For instance, if we went down to South Africa and were able to work with Business Bridge or a government agency and get a long list of small firm owners, and we could even go out to them and measure, those that have higher skills or lower skills, and also their performance, right? And we observed that those with higher marketing skills also had higher firm performance. We wouldn't be able to rule out that some unobserved factor like motivation or ability was driving profits and also correlated with skills. Likewise, reverse causality issues loom large. It might not be that skills are driving performance, but it could be that I have to be a small firm owner operating a successful business in order to have those slack resources, financial or time, such that I could go out and afford that really expensive Penn State MBA that boosts my skills. And thirdly, self-selection issues are also problematic. Even if we worked with Business Bridge and went out and observed everyone who finished their program and measured and saw an increase in their skills as well as an increase in performance, we wouldn't have a counterfactual of what would have happened to that same firm owner had they not attended training. So what we do, our solution, is to run a randomized controlled trial in South Africa with hundreds of small business owners. And the basic idea is we go out and we recruit almost 1,000 small business owners. We get some metrics at their business location. We then invite them to a registration session at a training center. We get more benchmark metrics on their performance as well as background factors of the business. After that, we randomize them into 3 groups, a group that gets marketing training, a group that gets finance training, and a third control or comparison group. And the key feature is that we have this control group so that as we measure over time, we have a counterfactual of what would have happened to those in the training group had they not gone through. I'm going to hand it over to Rajesh to talk a little bit more about the rigor of our design.
The randomized controlled trial approach allows us to address some of the challenges and the difficulties that Stephen pointed to earlier. Some have called it the gold standard in dealing with these challenges of identification. Now, the advantages of this approach is, one, it is appropriate technology for the context we're trying to study. In the words of the statistician, well-known statistician Donald Rubin, for causal identification, design trumps analysis. So if we design things well, analysis could be very simple. I was at a talk this morning by an eminent marketing scientist, Sudhir, who pointed out that as we look for excellence in marketing science and new contributions in marketing science, the thing we should be emphasizing, the 3 C's, as he puts it, are contribution, correctness, and clarity. And he pointed out that rigor does not necessarily, rigor, which is a desirable thing, does not necessarily mean complexity. In fact, complexity, he suggested, is something to be avoided as much as possible. And it allows, this randomized controlled trial approach allows us to measure things or manipulate things in advance, so that our measurement and analysis can be quite simple. So ex-ante manipulation rather than ex-post data collection and dealing with messy data. And finally, we believe this is the first marketing study that involves manipulation and a field experiment involving hundreds, 852 specifically, firms, rather than one firm, and in the field rather than, as is often the case, online or in some other form. Let me, to highlight the contributions of the study, it's worth hearing from David McKinsey. David is the lead economist at the World Bank in private sector and development, and he's probably the expert on the impact of the role of micro-entrepreneurs in developing countries. So here's David McKinsey.
Development in developing countries, and I've done a lot of work on business training in different places, including a meta-analysis critical review of different business training studies. So one of the things we found there was that a lot of recent attempts had been made to look at how business training had worked, and very few of them had found any effects. And they hadn't found any effects for a couple of clear reasons. They just didn't have enough sample size, they had very weak training, and they weren't very good at measuring the outcomes. And so this is where this paper, I think, is really exciting, because it deals with all 3 of these issues. It has a very strong intensive training. It tries to separate 2 types of training and tell us not just does training matter, but what types of training matter and how. It pays a lot of very careful attention to measurement, to these tricky outcomes of firm profits and sales, where many of these types of firms have never kept records before, and if you're not very careful at how you measure it, you just have so much noise that you can never measure any effects. And it finds these very striking results that business training really is effective, or can be effective, and it leads to very sensible changes in different pathways, where if you do marketing training, you get more sales. If you do finance training, you lower costs, and both of them lead to improving profits. And so, this is probably the strongest set of results I've seen of any attempt to do business training evaluations in a developing country, and I think this is a fantastic study.
Great. So as David alluded to, we tried to come up with some innovations in our research design in order to bolster our ability to detect these effects, to strengthen our overall research design. And I'll go through each of these in a little bit of detail. But just to highlight, the first is in terms of sampling. Whereas previous studies really involved a mixed bag of subsistence and sometimes even non-operational firms, we go to careful lengths to ensure that everyone in our sample is operational and a little more established. Second, we also try to ensure we have a stronger intervention, as well as one that focuses solely on marketing. And lastly, develop some new electronic surveying methods that allow for more precise and valid measures of key performance indicators. So first, in terms of sampling, our target population, this is Greater Cape Town, is going to be small firm owners. And so we need to ensure that they're both operational, right? These are not aspirational people who just have ideas about business. They need to be operating already. And they can't just be subsistence or survivalists. For those of you who had visited some of these contexts, you'll see many so-called entrepreneurs just selling their goods on the side of the street. We need to make sure that we're working with legitimate small firms that are a little bigger. So what we do, you might think you could start off by going to one of these contexts, going to a government office and getting a list of all of the SMEs working in that context, right? And start calling them up and say, are you interested in training? We started there. We tried that. We had strong links with the Western Cape government and found out quickly that most of the lists were garbage. They were just either made up names or numbers that led to no one, or they were indeed people not actually running real businesses. They were hoping for a handout. So we had to scrap that. And instead, we had to conduct a census going door to door for 10 weeks using a team of 12 RAs, right, to identify this sample from scratch. And we literally had a war room where we printed out large posters of all of the business districts in Greater Cape Town, had them all up on the wall in this huge conference center we were using, and we would, describe all of the different intersections and streets where our RA teams would go over 10 weeks to try to recruit this sample. In addition, I had to develop new methods. I call it the Growth Potential Index tool, which uses proxies on business and background characteristics of entrepreneurs to try to identify those who are a little bit more committed and motivated to grow, as well as more established. And using both of these techniques, we were able to recruit what we think made a difference, a sample of firms that were a little more established as well as operational. And indeed, our sample did have firms that had at least 2 paid staff, at least $2,000 almost USD per month in sales, as well as substantial profits. They then had to attend a registration session at one of these very large SME centers, and after that we randomized them into the 3 groups as I described. A second challenge is that historically, or up until this point, most of the training interventions had been fairly weak. For example, it might have been working with a microfinance institute, and I'm going to offer training, maybe 1 day a month for an hour or 2 every time the loan group gets together, right? And it was fairly weak, and they weren't finding substantial effects on changes in practices. And in order for us to have a stronger intervention, what we realized is we couldn't just go out, let Business Bridge do the training, and then hire a survey firm to collect the data and sit in our ivory towers and magically hope that things work out. Instead, we hired and managed a team that sometimes had 30 or 40 staff to carry this out. We couldn't use one training center. We needed a large sample. We had to work with 5 different training partners, centers. And then in terms of the skills training, as Tom mentioned already, we had to convince Business Bridge to change their model, adapt it, right, so we could learn from some of the prior studies and ensure that it really focused on the application of marketing practices or behavioral changes. Right? And so instead of having people come in for 3 days and bombard them with a whole bunch of information and think magically they're going to learn it and go apply it, we changed the model such that they would come 1 day a week for 3 or 4 hours, learn some basic concepts, go back, apply it, come back 1 week after another until they hit 10 weeks. And just to focus, there was the marketing intervention, as you know, as well as the finance intervention. But in terms of the strength or intensity, okay, the average firm owner who attended in our marketing group would have received upwards of 80, but typically 60 hours of sort of exposure to marketing concepts and application. These are a summary of some of the prior studies. And you can see, one, the intensity is much lower, and another point to highlight is the role of marketing tended to sort of get pushed to the side. Only a few hours was ever covered, right? And so we isolate marketing and ensure that it's also more intense. We did a lot of checks to try to ensure that the marketing and finance training interventions were also as comparable as possible. And lastly, in terms of measurement, what we had to do, and let me just set this up, most of these firm owners, right, they do not keep any formal financial records, okay? They don't have audited books. They don't have monthly or even quarterly statements that you could go and send an enumerator. They copy the information down, and you go back and you know you're getting accurate data. Most of them don't even keep a sales log. Okay? And so what that's meant for studies before is that the measures are so noisy that even though a true effect could exist, your entire design is underpowered and you can't pick up the effects. And so what I developed was a new electronic tool to improve precision and accuracy. I'll give you a flavor of it. This, for example, is trying to estimate or get at information around sales. And so rather than what typical studies do is just say, what were your sales last month? Simple recall. Instead, I would ask sales in 3 different ways, covering 3 different time periods. And using these 3 pieces of information, I triangulate onto a number that had an upper bound and a lower bound, and I would lower the variance of that estimate. I would then go through 12 different cost categories of the business, each broken down into subcategories, aggregate up, and at the end, we'd even get something that looks something like an income statement, right, where all of the costs, which a lot of these people know the pain of paying, they know costs, and they get close to sales, and you end up with a profit estimate that they can go back and anchor and adjust until they get a number that they think is more believable. All right, and we think that this, it definitely reduces variance. I have another methods paper on this. We think that these 3 innovations in terms of our research design hopefully made a difference in our ability to pick up effects. And those effects are what Rajesh is going to talk about next.
At some level, you could see effects just from knowing the individuals, the 852 individuals who we got to know over an 18-month period. But what I'm going to share here are some numbers that measure the impact. And the general approach I'm going to use here is to show you results for marketing relative to control, and the increases or decreases or no effects, and finance relative to control. So the first bottom line question is, did profits go up as a result of this intervention? Profits did go up in both cases, but in the marketing condition, the profits were 61% higher. Now, 61% higher implies about $300 extra in profits for the typical business. The $300 extra for a business doesn't seem like a lot. But in fact, $300 is how much an employee at the South African equivalent of Walmart or Tesco or Carrefour, if you're European, earns per month. So the extra profits would have been enough in quantitative terms to hire a person at that level. What we next look at is the pathways to profit. Is the path to profits different for those who have marketing skills relative to finance skills? And remember, the skills are the result of random allotment through a lottery. And what is the impact? Our hypothesis is that those who have marketing skills will focus on top line and growth. And those with finance skills will focus on efficiency. And so the rest of the remaining numbers I'll share with you will describe these figures. So sales go up fairly substantially, 64% increase, and that's significant. It's not significant different finance. For finance, there's a whole lot of variation there. Employee numbers. The sales increases are a function of the number of employees they hire. And this is important in South Africa, where in the context we're studying, unemployment rates are about 50% among otherwise economically active adults. 50% unemployment. Each employee represents a new job for the South African government. Costs do go up. The employees don't come for free. And so in the marketing group, costs go up. Finance, the difference is not significant relative to the control group. And if you look at outputs, sales relative to costs, the efficiency ratio is substantially higher in the finance case. What we'll do next is focus on practice. This is practice prize. And we'll show next that these changes in performance were the result of changes in specific marketing practices. And in 3 categories. One, did they do more market research? Very simple question. So for instance, did you visit a competitor's business to see what products they sell? Did you ask a supplier which products are selling well in the industry? Did you ask customers if they'd like you to sell more of a certain thing, etc.? Or marketing tactics that have to do with the 4 Ps generally, or sales tactics. And what we show is that those who received the marketing skills training did change marketing practices relative to those who received finance training. And so this is the percentage who implemented 10 or more of those 15 practices. Now, even though that's not the comprehensive list of all possible marketing practices, what we also show is that set of marketing practices actually is very strongly correlated with profits. And the intervention in marketing treatment has an effect. About 55% of the variance explained in profits is through that change in changes in marketing profits. Now, what I'd like to invite Steve to do next is talk about next steps and transportability.
Great. So as Rajesh just highlighted, The intervention we used in South Africa changed the behaviors, the marketing practices of hundreds of small firm owners, and in turn had positive outcomes like improvements in sales and profits. Now, although we're excited about that, what we're more excited about are the ways in which we can take some of the innovations of our current research design and have already started to apply them in new contexts. The first is that we took this growth potential tool and we're now using it in Uganda, where the service provider is trying to scale up a remote coaching model. All right? And here, the basic idea is you take a local business owner and pair them up with a coach or consultant who's located halfway across the world. And for 6 months, they work together just using Skype and mobile phone to improve the business. The challenge, however, is how you might recruit hundreds and hundreds of these small local business owners without a large infrastructure on the ground. And we can use this growth potential index tool to collect data and use these questions to segment the market. We develop a GPI score for every one of the business owners, and we're able to separate them from higher or lower growth potential, and then the service provider, the NGO, is able to target who they want for this program. And this is not just being used by this particular NGO with 2,000 businesses in Uganda, Rwanda, and Malawi, but also now the data from this and the insights are going into a brief to the President's office in Uganda. We're providing this data to the World Bank and DFID team to help inform that policy. In addition, we take the EntreInfo data platform, some of these surveying and measurement tools, and we're now applying them in Rwanda in a very different context. The idea here is we're scaling up, already working with, and technically already aligned, working with 3 of the largest telcos, mobile operators in Africa, to deliver the same type of measurement of outcomes, of marketing information, and giving it back to their owners themselves. So rather than using it for research, we're using it for them to have access to their own business information and analytics. Again, we take this EntreInfo tool, and a lot of the owners, when we were measuring, would have this light bulb moment and say, wow, I've never seen all of my sales records in one spot. Can I have this? Can I have access to this? But the challenge is, how do you do that at scale? And instead of using smartphones or slick apps, we've developed everything around SMS tools and SMS-based messaging to create a market manager app, which is now going live in Rwanda with all 3 of the largest telcos, and we can hit 98.5% of the market because everyone almost has a mobile that's SMS enabled. And we'll track information around products, information around customers, and having access to that, we'll be able to see if it improves their business performance. And lastly, in terms of marketing skills, what we think one of the biggest lessons from this project is that we're able to increase the voice of marketing at the policy table. And one of the first examples is I got asked to join this $200 million project with the Nigerian government and the World Bank, and I'm the only marketer involved, and the other economist is David McKenzie. And here I'm getting to actually infuse in all of, whether it's the training programs or the new insourcing and outsourcing programs we're developing, or the entire growth database, I'm getting to put and ensure that there's equal emphasis on marketing as there is on finance and accounting across all of these different features. And we'll end by having our co-authors speak about that a little bit.
And one of the co-authors of this paper that is being presented for the Marketing Prize. Since I work at the World Bank, which is one of the largest international development organizations in the world, I have potentially a unique perspective on the impact that this paper is having and the research insights are having on both practice and policymaking. So in terms of practice, this paper has some very unique and useful insights for practitioners. For one, as multinational firms are looking into emerging markets to expand their operations, they inevitably have to interact with these small businesses as their customers, as their suppliers, as their distributors. So what our results show is that they provide these multinational firms and other organizations very useful benchmarks that can help them enhance the business skills of their partners on the ground. So in that sense, it is very useful for practice. In terms of policy, it's actually perhaps even more compelling. The argument is even more compelling because the World Bank alone spends over $1 billion per year on business training programs of some sort. Yet the impact of such programs is unclear. And prior to this paper, the impact has been shown to be very, very mixed. So what this paper shows is not just that the impact is there, but it also shows the mechanism of how that impact happens and the steps, the chain of impact from business training to changes in practices to essentially and then leading to changes in outcomes. So the insights from this are very applicable to other settings, and in fact, the insights have already been used in other World Bank projects, for example, in Nigeria, where business training programs have been molded based on the insights from this study. So in terms of both practice and policy making, the insights, this paper and its results are extremely useful from a practical standpoint. Thank you.
So we'd just like to end on a final note, which is that probably our biggest lesson from this project was how inspired we are about the potential opportunities for marketing science to have transformative effects in emerging markets and beyond. If we consider, for instance, that there's 2 billion people at least living on $2 a day, half of them are estimated to be running a business, a small business. That means 1 billion market size for marketers to try to have an impact. And if we just develop marketing interventions like the one we did here, we change, improve their profits by a few $100s a month, $5,000 a year, we're looking at $1 trillion value creation opportunity for marketing science to have an economic and social impact in the world. And these are interventions that anyone in this room, any academics like us, could take forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations for an impressive project. My first question is on, obviously marketing skills are important, but could you elaborate more upon which kind of marketing skill had the largest impact? So you had different lessons, I think 10 different ones. So which of the skills you taught them had the strongest impact?
Okay, so we didn't break down the composite that Rajesh reviewed in terms of those 15 practices, and again, one thing we want to step away. We don't randomize those, right? So these are intervening outcomes. So we don't want to step too much and say pricing matters more than, for instance, promotions. But in this context, when we do look at the correlation of these practices with future profits, the biggest bang for the buck seems to be in those related to the tracking. In this case, market research. So they seem to have the biggest difference, right? The biggest take-up. They also seem to be the most correlated. So it might be something that seems like low-hanging fruit, right? The ability to go out, see what my competitors are selling, what are they selling, what are the prices they're selling at, can I go to different suppliers and perhaps negotiate lower prices or get access to different goods to diversify my portfolio. These sort of basic things around market research seem to have the biggest bang for the buck. But we don't want to claim that they work better than sales tactics. We don't randomize those. And in fact, there could be a different RCT on every single one of those that we encourage other people to go out and do.
But in general, marketing metrics seem to matter among the micro-entrepreneurs as well.
Okay. My second question would be, you talked about scaling up the program. I was wondering about scaling down in a sense of you had the growth potential index and you had a certain threshold and you looked at people that had a higher index than your threshold. I was wondering what would happen if you include people that have a lower growth potential index?
Yeah. So actually in the GPI scores, we still have substantial variation across their characteristics as well as their performance. And we don't report here, but we do see that other background factors do matter, separate of these GPI scores. And we go into that in a separate paper. But here we do find that if we interact the growth potential scores with some randomized treatment, both in this project and another one, that those effects are greater, right? So when you do come in with a little bit higher threshold level of motivation and commitment, as well as you're actually operating a business a little more established, you do see, these are the businesses. It sort of makes sense, right? They actually are running operational businesses that when you give them these skills, they can put them into practice and see real changes versus those that are lower GPI scores and more subsistence. Is that?
And the general realization is that many of us are not cut out to be entrepreneurs. And that exists elsewhere as well. So I'd be a terrible entrepreneur, perhaps on the growth potential index for a bunch of reasons as well. And what people really need are jobs. And the growth potential index is our attempt at highlighting those who are, and this is yet to be tested at scale, but those who would have the greatest opportunity to create those. So, but within that is a huge variance in itself.
Okay, but you make me curious. So the growth potential index essentially measures entrepreneurial abilities?
No. It is, well, Stephen, why don't you talk some more?
Yeah, no, we don't measure entrepreneurial abilities or even entrepreneurial spirit. It's just simply proxies, right? So one of the difficulties here is if I ask a bunch of attitudinal skills that people can game, I might not get better measures for which to separate the wheat from the chaff. In this case, we look at proxies. So we don't ask them, how do you feel about growth? Are you more established? Instead, we go back and ask them about their customers, how long they've been serving them, right? And a series to get up at some proxy around, are they really operational, right? Have they been exchanging money for goods and services during the last 6 months? Right, so we try to use proxies. Likewise, we could say someone who's managed, like that hairdresser example, to get the container, get it on the land, get it wired for electricity, that could proxy for some persistence. Right? It's not easy to get all of that together. And so we're just looking, again, we're not thinking we're going to be able to identify the Silicon Valley transformational entrepreneurs. We're just saying, look, when policymakers have limited dollars to spend, or if I was a multinational thinking, who should I partner with? I need ways maybe to separate the wheat from the chaff, and this is our first attempt at segmenting and targeting in these market contexts.
So again, I've said this to you outside of this context, but it's hard not to be impressed by the scale of what has been done, and so it's clearly a very impressive project. That said, I have a couple of questions about the results, and one thing that is a highlight of the result is that the incremental percentage contribution and the increase in revenues that you get from marketing actions is much higher. And we also know that result happens to be stronger for the smaller entrepreneurs, because the smaller entrepreneurs are the ones that are doing better on the marketing stuff, and the slightly larger entrepreneurs are the ones who are doing better on the finance stuff, right? And so in this kind of a randomization, right, so there is a mix of people, but there is self-selection into who is going to actually take action around the training that you're going to do. And so that creates an interesting mix, which normally would not be a problem, but in this case, because the marketing guys are going to get much bigger, so you move from 1 to 2, you get 100% to 200%. Right? And the guy going from 4 to 5 will get a 20% increase because on the finance side. And so that potentially can lead to some interesting differences. And I was curious as to how does one be sure that this result is not because of this heterogeneity in the treatment effect, which is inbuilt into this percentage calculation, and because that's very important for the robustness of your result and the clarity and validity of your results.
Just to clarify, we showed the percentage results here, but the regressions that are in the paper are not based on percentage results. So those are the actual numbers.
Those are the intention to treat estimates that are based on the randomized offer of training. So there isn't selection. We're not looking at the local average treatment effect of just the result conditional on take-up of training or even completion of training. These are the intention to treat estimates, or the average effects averaged over everyone randomly assigned to marketing, or in that case. So,
but it's not the intention to treat part or the completion. It is the intention to act on the thing, and there, the selection is there, and the mixture is going to be there. And so I was again, it would be kind of worth, I think, pushing that to make sure that the arguments actually.
Yeah, and we could do some sub-analysis on those heterogeneous treatment effects for sure.
That's
Definitely.
a very excellent point.
Yeah. Anyone else from the audience? We really appreciate the time and the opportunity, so thank you.